Thank you, Zach. So just to start off, to give you a kind of feel for the kind of presentation that I have in store for you, the official title of my talk is My Ill-Fated and Ultimately Unsuccessful Quest to Become a Polymath. So basically, the idea here is that when I first heard about this topic the topic for this was released sometime around last summer, and I was a little bit disappointed because I'd attended the festival in the previous year, and I had resolved to participate in some capacity the next time around. And I was even a bit excited. These plans came to a grinding halt, however, as a simple but nonetheless significant detail dawned on me. I actually did not have the faintest idea what a polymath was at all. So my ignorance, coupled with an irrational fear that everyone in the school would soon know that I, a mathematician, no less, didn't know the meaning of the word polymath, brought about a panicked visit to the internet. So given that my primary source of information about polymaths was Wikipedia at the time, I abandoned for the time being all hopes of presenting in this festival and did not think about it for several weeks. But the desire to contribute in some capacity still lingered. And so one day, while I was absent-mindedly thinking about nothing in particular, the way that mathematicians tend to do, I somewhat facetiously conceded to myself that the only way that I would be able to contribute to a festival in which I'm so intellectually unqualified is if I made that the centerpiece of my presentation. So basically, I'm telling you right now that I did not know anything about polymathy, and I'm trying to convince you that this is a good thing, okay? So somehow and altogether expectedly, this idea started to sound better and better. And I was thinking to myself, that'll show them. Then no one will know that I didn't know. And so that was kind of the genesis of this idea. And here we go. Well, as it turns out, as the title suggests, becoming a master of several disciplines in a very short period of time is not as easy as it might sound. And what I'm here to offer instead is a personal account of an attempt to make sense of, like Zach was talking about, the different ways in which we can engage the world, make sense of the world, the different perspectives that we can use. So let's start at the beginning with the journey that landed me here at USAO. So I caught my first real sense of the liberal arts in my phone interview that was conducted with the search committee, and until then, my exposure to disciplines other than mathematics at the university level consisted of the general education curriculum at a large research university, whose name will be withheld in case this ends up on the internet. This is to say, I did not have much. Saying that large research universities value the liberal arts is a little bit like saying that Chicken Express is committed to fine dining. It's just not very much. So my wife and I have, my apologies to those connoisseurs of Chicken Express. My wife and I have a lot of family in the Oklahoma City area, and we were committed to staying here. And so at least initially, my attraction to USAO was one that was purely of location. And so this offered the best chance to remain in Oklahoma. And so I prepared for my phone interview like a law student prepares for the bar exam. So I plan to knowledgeably discuss everything from the conventional interview topics, what is your teaching philosophy, what is your interest in this position, to the more absurd. So I'd actually planned to show off that I knew how to pronounce the word chickasha, to show how I was kind of micromanaging my interview and just being really neurotic about it. So I did my research too, of course, reading up on the IDS program, browsing through the course catalog, looking at old news archives and whatnot. My goal was fairly ambitious, admittedly. It was nothing less than to have the search committee simultaneously weeping over the sheer beauty and eloquence of my responses while at the same time applauding. So I didn't quite know what dynamic I wanted, but I knew that I wanted them to just be so struck with the eloquence and depth of my responses that they would have no chance or no choice but to give me the job and who knows, maybe even give me tenure right off the bat. That second one Still hasn't happened yet, not for several years. So none of that happened, of course, because I had written down the wrong time for my phone interview. This is something that I actually haven't told the committee yet, and I see that several of them are here. So when the phone rang for the most important interview of my life, I was in line at Walmart. And that's not so bad, you might say. You were probably there for a good reason. Maybe you were buying medicine for your son or something like that. And I would answer, well, only if a grocery cart containing beer, dog food, and cheese explosion goldfish limited edition could be in any way construed as important. So I quickly abandoned my shopping cart and sprinted to the parking lot, answering the phone breathless along the way. Doctors Nancy Warden, Jeannie Mather, Quan Tran, and J.C. Sanders proceeded to pepper me with questions, but I didn't have my notes in front of me, and I had to settle for basically throwing in bits and pieces of what I remembered from those notes. It felt very erratic and unfocused, and I felt as if I had been rambling, which is basically a search committee's worst nightmare. So the hours following the phone interview were filled with self-loathing. I felt as if I had just jeopardized my family's only chance to stay in Oklahoma, which is what we wanted to do. And now I held the perhaps irrational fear that the only place I would be able to find a job would be somewhere far away like Maine or North Korea. So you already know that this story has a happy ending, okay? That I'm standing before you today indicates that I have somehow managed to cobble together enough coherent sentence fragments to adequately convey my teaching philosophy and outlook on the liberal arts and whatnot. I told Zach Simpson this story this morning, actually, and he said that the impromptu nature of the interview, inadvertently impromptu nature, might have been to my benefit because perhaps it came across as more natural and authentic. You can ask the search committee that afterwards, I guess. So a substantial chunk of the questions, so the reason why I'm telling you this entire story is that a substantial chunk of the questions were related to the interdisciplinary program and went far beyond surface level. So I was asked to venture my ideas for new IDS courses, if I would be comfortable teaching courses in a different discipline, and how I viewed mathematics in the broad spectrum of the liberal arts. These are questions that I had not anticipated in my notes. And so these questions really made an impression on me. These people at USAO don't mess around. This is the big leagues. So since my hiring and subsequent assimilation into USAO culture, I'm still impressed by my fellow faculty's dedication to this liberal arts mission. And one recent experience was particularly formative in this regard. So I was asked to serve on a search committee for the new economics and finance faculty member. And initially I was a bit anxious and wary because until somewhat recently my idea of a financial asset was the detergent bucket full of pennies that I kept in my garage. So I opted instead to give it a shot. I was hoping that my non-existent expertise in this area would defy the odds and somehow make a positive contribution. So while I suppose whether I succeeded or not might be a matter of some debate, I came to realize that what makes a good mathematics professor at its core is very similar to what makes a good finance and economics professor, almost as if the qualifications were not discipline specific. Of course, there's some that are discipline specific, but in general, that's what I began to see. I began to pick out the qualities in these applications that I would pick out for someone that I was hiring, perhaps as my colleague sometime in the future. So whatever these qualifications might be, I anticipated or came to realize that these are exactly those qualifications that we might expect to find in a polymath. So this brings us to the present. I met and spoke with members of our esteemed faculty across 4 disciplines. So Blake Morgan in fine arts, Chris Martin in economics, David Zodaway in science, and Zach Simpson in philosophy and religious studies. So obviously I was not able to cover the full spectrum of the liberal arts, but I hope that what I've selected gives a valuable overview nonetheless. Plus, I had to limit it at 4 because I was informed that if my presentation went too long, my office would be relocated to a supply closet. Renata she can be very scary. So the first person I talked to was Blake, and so I had the pleasure of attending last fall's DaVinci Forum with Blake at East Central University, which is his alma mater, and Blake, you have to understand, is a bit of a celebrity at ECU. So during our tour of the art museum, the students and faculty were just aflutter with whispers, and they were saying, is that Blake Morgan? Is that the Blake Morgan? And I was thinking, this is ridiculous. It was similar to a scene as if you had seen Kevin Durant walking in Bricktown or something like that. So naturally, I jumped at the chance to learn about fine arts from the Blake Morgan. Blake's office is tucked away on the third floor of Davis Hall and is very difficult to find, I found, unless you have a mountain goat and a Sherpa handy. I'd never been on the third floor of Davis Hall before. And Blake's office looks like you might expect an art professor's to look. There were paintings on the walls, sculptures rolled up, and canvases festooned across the floor. And I noted with a tinge of jealousy that his computer is way better than mine. So I started off by asking him what he believes it takes to be a successful artist. And what he said was to be fascinated by it and to be able to work very hard at it. And I easily identified with this because you hear something very, very similar from mathematicians all the time. But we discussed how that might be necessary for success. It perhaps wasn't sufficient. So in other words, there are lots of aspiring artists who work very hard and have lots of drive that end up not making it professionally. And Blake responded by saying, even if someone is not going to be a professional painter, if they approach it with interest and fascination, I think it will give them a meaningful way to engage the world. I think that's really important. So you can see some of the tie-ins already to this concept of polymathy. And so he continued to say, here's the fun thing about teaching. If you go about it right, you can get just about everybody interested. You can get all of your students interested. What's fun about teaching, what's fun about learning this stuff is discovering it for yourself. And I found that particularly struck me and stayed with me. So Chris Martin, I talked to second. He had served with me on the Finance and Economics Search Committee. So during both the phone interviews and the on-campus interviews, Chris asked incredibly deep and meaningful questions of our candidates that made the rest of us look like we had Googled, how do I give a phone interview 5 minutes prior? So he was reading articles from the New York Times and asking the candidates what they thought about that and whatnot. And so naturally, I figured that he would be a good person to talk to. So I initiated the conversation with Chris by asking about how he views economics in the broad spectrum of the liberal arts. I asked these questions to everybody in varying order to somewhat informally get the conversation going. And so he paused contemplatively for about 10 seconds. And he just kind of, as if he was crafting the perfect response in his head. And so he responded by saying the place of economics in the liberal arts is studying the implications of scarcity and self-interest for social behavior. Along the same lines, he later continued, economics is a system of thought about inductions from human nature, which to me was not exactly what I was expecting. I was expecting to hear something about, well, the economy for one thing, but I had naively supposed that his response would include words like econometrics, economic indicators, multiple regression analysis, things like that, and was pleasantly surprised to learn that there was more to economics than that. So Chris put it this way. He said, he quoted Leonard Read's story of the manufacturing of a pencil to demonstrate what he was talking about. He said, even a pencil is sitting in a nexus of relationships, trade, and knowledge. It's such that no one individual person could manufacture a pencil. But by cooperating, each of us only needs to know the part of the process that we are engaged in. We all coordinate through this massively complex thing called the economy, and it allows us to punch far above our weight with regard to what we can accomplish. We both digested this for a few seconds, and it's a great example, I thought. Something as unassuming and mundane as a pencil serves as a brilliant metaphor for just how complicated the global economy is. So basically, this was completely different from what I had expected, and so he went on to talk about how the economy is much more complex than we think it is, and he says, our models are not as good as we think. Maybe at best we can come up with a few general rules, but much of it is a vast area of ignorance. And so I thought, well, what does this mean for his students? How do you teach a subject that is so unwieldy and so sophisticated? What big picture do you hope that your students take from a class like this? And Chris responded that the successful economics undergraduate is someone who can answer questions about the world. Economics gives them a way to do that. So again, we have this kind of emerging theme of a discipline being a lens that we can use to view the world. So the next person I talked to is David Zodaway. For my purposes, he was a particularly efficient person to talk to because his degree is in biophysical chemistry. And I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I know that it means that he can teach about just about any course in Austin Hall, which I imagine is what made him attractive to USAO. He's also an opera singer. So there's a funny story about this. So David teaches right before me on Tuesday mornings and is often erasing the chalkboard, gathering his things as my trigonometry class trickles in. And some of the students were discussing different singers and musicians, and I said that Dr. Zodaway is a talented opera singer, and they didn't believe me, but that's probably also because I threw in that he was also a karate black belt and a secret agent for the Russian government. So David was apparently very unsatisfied to have opera singer seem as preposterous as the other two options I provided. So he took matters into his own hands and serenaded my trigonometry class last Thursday morning. Some kind of, I guess it was Italian. It was Italian, yes. Okay. And there were just incredulous looks on my students' faces because you could see each one of them thinking, well, if opera singer is true, maybe we don't want to mess around with Dr. Zodaway. So anyway, I was interested to talk to David because even though mathematicians are usually classified as scientists, I don't really consider myself a scientist because, frankly, I just don't know all that much about chemistry or biology or anything like that. In fact, were it not for a certain section that's in every math textbook almost that I've ever seen, I would have thought that radioactive dating was some kind of hookup website for lonely scientists instead of a way for finding the age of fossils. So I started by asking David what he thought it took to be a successful scientist, and he said probably the one thing it takes to be successful is passion. You have to be passionate about learning. So he went on to tell me that he had his kidney removed when he was 7 years old, and he said, I was very curious about what had happened to me. What was a kidney? Could I survive without it? Would I be okay? That was the foundation of striving to find out everything I could about the human body, and that led to a love of science. He spoke about possessing an insatiable curiosity for how things work and how science helps us figure out exactly how things in the physical world work. So I brought up the same thing that I did to Chris Martin. Science is, we've been able to do remarkable things with science, figure out some things that we really have no business knowing. But there's also, that's frankly dwarfed by what we don't know. And so he said, you have to figure out one thing that interests you and go with that. Be passionate about figuring out that one thing. And so I did some research on the internet. David's one thing is apparently called detection of alpha helical coiled coil dimer formation by spin-labeled synthetic peptides, a model parallel coiled coil peptide in the anti-parallel coiled coil formed by replica of the pro-PC terminus. So I think David's in the back. Let's give him a round of applause for that really quickly. So I couldn't help but ask about opera singing. He said the thing about singing for me is that I love making beautiful harmonies, and I like the way interesting voices sound together. But he didn't stop there. He said I also like doing impressions. I like imitating. I like to mimic other people's voices. And despite my repeated attempts to give an impression of Dr. Marble or President Fever, he declined, even though I promised not to put it on YouTube. So there's always a next time. We'll see what happens with that. So the final faculty member that I talked to was Dr. Zach Simpson, and I didn't really know what to expect from Zach because first, my knowledge of philosophy does not extend far beyond basically listing famous philosophers. I've observed Dr. Simpson on many occasions competently engaging in conversations involving a broad spectrum of topics: political science, mathematics, religion, biology. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised. He is a professor of interdisciplinary studies. And so I didn't exactly know what kind of response I would get. And I know my wife is sitting back there giving me warnings on time, and I know that my 20 minutes is almost up. So I'm going to give you the basic idea of my conversation with Zach. He said, "I have a conception of philosophy as the criticism of concepts, the skill of understanding how different systems of thought operate independently of one another and how they interact. I like to show my students how systems of thought change over time. I want them to see the positive side of change, but also the negative side that comes along with that. Every system of thought operates in this way." And he proceeded with an example that was very similar to what I talked about with David. He said that science does that too. Science is a system of thought that does that too. Science limits the realm of inquiry, and by doing so, it can create all of these incredible results, but it's also casting off chaos. And I silently noted to myself that casting off chaos would be a great name for a band. So if you're interested in that, you can thank me later. Basically, when we boil down to it, what he said was, ultimately, you're just trying to get people to a point where they can ask better questions. And so he said, and then he added, it seems like he couldn't help to add this, this kind of a sly smirk came over his face. He said, philosophy doesn't answer any questions, it just raises them, and that's why philosophers never make any progress. So anyway, so as the title of my talk implies, my quest was not a rip-roaring success. So I don't stand before you right now today a polymath, but if you'll humor me as I attempt to salvage this presentation and maintain some semblance of respectability, I believe I gained some insight into how polymaths think, or more generally, how those with a broad interdisciplinary reach view their own disciplines. A powerful prevailing theme I noticed was that the four experts that I talked to each view their own discipline as a lens through which we can view the world. For Blake Morgan, the way in which you engage and read a painting provides an avenue through which you can engage the world at large. For Chris Martin, the study of self-interest and response to incentives is a mean through which we can view and analyze society and human behavior. For David Zodaway, science is the lens that we can use to understand the physical world. And for Zach Simpson, philosophy is a tool that can be used to question and critique these other disciplines, raising questions, of course, but never actually answering them. So paramount in achieving these goals across the board was an unquenchable sense of fascination that came up multiple times in each discussion, and a passion to explore it. So the desire to keep asking questions and the drive to keep answering them. So, and now as I look out in the audience, I realize that I'm probably telling all of you something that you already know. So this is the norm here, right? This is an indelible part of our culture here at USAO. And what I'm realizing more and more is that's exactly what makes this place special. Of course, it took me a while to figure that out. Still working on it, but it took me a while to figure it out. But you have to give me some credit because I've come a very long way from that nearly tragic day in Walmart. Thank you.